Welcome Week special. It was one of my regular scheduled talks, but it fell in Welcome Week, so this one is no charge today, and a good way to introduce people to some interesting stories about Revelstoke. How many of you here are new to Revelstoke? Like 6 months or less? Quite a few. Yeah, so welcome, and we're doing another talk this Friday at 2 o'clock. I call it Revelstoke History 101, so some of the basics of what you need to know to pretend that you're local. Like the fact that things like if somebody tells you that they were born in Save-On-Foods, you understand why when you learn that that's where the hospital was. So today is mysteries and puzzles. So it's things that there's some unsolved crimes, but also some things that that a few photographs that I haven't been able to quite figure out, and some few things that we'll just look at together. Just as we start, we acknowledge the land, traditions, and culture of 4 nations. Following the Columbia River to the north, the Secwepemc. To the east, to the Selkirk Mountains, the Tanaha. Following the Columbia River south, the Snipes. To the west, to the Monashee Mountains, the Silk. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land sacred to these 4 nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. I'm going to start with a sad story. This is the story of a woman named Jenny Kiabara. This is her grave marker in the cemetery. She died in 1905, so that's about how old that marker is. I'm not sure how long after her death it was put up. But on the marker, it says Jenny, Japanese. And there's some Japanese script there. And I had my friend Tomo Fujimura was able to look at that with me, and we was able to determine that her Japanese name is on there, as well as her age, which was 24. And at the age of 24, she was murdered. We knew that she had been in Revelstoke as early as 1903. Her name comes up in the city police files that we have as somebody who was working as a prostitute. The police files have a record of everybody who was brought in and arrested on any charge. There were quite a few women that were charged with prostitution, quite a few of them over several times. They were often brought in 3 or 4 times a year and charged. The women who were running the houses were charged up to $20 every time they were brought in, and the women who were working in the houses were charged $4 to $5. So it was a considerable amount of money back in 1900. So we know that Jenny shows up in the police files in around that time, around 1903, and there was also a court case involving her when one of her Caucasian clients beat her up. And surprisingly enough, for both the fact that she was a prostitute and that she was a visible minority, the perpetrator was actually sent to jail for the crime. He beat her quite savagely. But on April 19th, 1905, she was found murdered in her house. And I have an idea of the possible house that it was. We can't be sure, but we know that she was living in a house owned by Hua Chung, who was a wealthy Chinese merchant living in town. He had several businesses, including the Oyster and Chop House restaurant on Mackenzie Avenue. But one of the houses that he had that was a known house of prostitution was a house that still stands just on Front Street, just at the very end of Front Street. So as you're coming across the Big Eddy Bridge and you make a right-hand turn onto Front Street, it's the one immediately on your left, sort of a square house. So it's possible that is the house that she was living in at the time of her death. There was no such thing as publication bans in the newspapers back in 1905, so every detail of the crime was given in the paper. Here's a brief example. Direct quote from the newspaper. The woman's throat was cut in front, and there was a frightful gash in the back of the neck so that the head was nearly severed from the body. The woman's hands were cut and hacked where she had struggled to obtain possession of the knife or ward off the work of the assassin, whose butchery was of the fiendish description. They went on to compare the murderer to Jack the Ripper. Of course, that wasn't too far back in history at that time. They also described the blood stains on the wall. They described the knife itself, and they even had the tag from the store on the knife. So they had all this evidence in front of them, but the murder was never solved. Wah Chung at one point was under suspicion, but he was never charged. And there was note in the newspaper that they were interviewing all of the other Japanese people who lived in town at the time. And there was a really sad note in the newspaper. It said that the Japanese and women of the neighborhood refused to assist the police by giving information. The Japanese say that the woman was no good, not worth hanging a man for. One of the really sad aspects of that is the fact that she would have been forcibly taken from her home in Japan to serve as a prostitute for the Japanese workers that were coming to Canada. So it was never her choice to enter into that. But I think some of this is speculation on my part, but she was no longer working strictly with the Japanese men, or working with the Japanese work crews that were in the area. She had a Chinese pimp, and she had Caucasian clients. So I think that could have been one of the factors that sort of set her apart from the Japanese people. Most of the Japanese who were living in here at the time were transient workers. They were working for the railway as laborers. There was a larger Chinese population at the time, but both of them certainly suffered discrimination in the local community. So the story of Jenny has kind of come into the realm of Revelstoke myth. I've heard a variety of stories. One story is that a Caucasian man was down in the United States, and on his deathbed, this would be in the 1930s, he confessed to the murder. And the story was that the information was relayed to the local police, and they told Wah Chung, and he said, "Oh, now I can die in peace." And that it was shortly after that he died. Total myth. We don't know if there's any truth in that. I've also had people tell me names of people that they think were the murderer, Caucasian names. Again, there's no proof of any of that, so it remains an unsolved murder. Her gravestone over the years, the base of it is kind of probably a bit of sandstone or something, and it's starting to erode. So I'm keeping an eye on that. We might at some point need to do a fundraising project to repair her gravestone, because I think she needs to continue to have that monument in her memory.
Who paid for it, Cathy?
It was paid for by Wah Chung.
Yeah, how many brothels were in town at that time?
There would have been several at that time, mostly centered on Front Street and Douglas Street, which was the original main part of downtown at that time. That was sort of the main business area was down in that area. So there were several, especially starting in 1885 when the town was established with the railway coming through. There were several, and there were actually brothels still at least one still in existence into the late 1940s. So I've got a couple of interesting little tidbits with some of the photographs here. I've put this photograph in. This is the house at 103rd Street. It says west on there, but I meant east. And it's just behind the United Church. And the reason I put that there is because I got a phone call from the local police station about 2007 asking me if I could come up there. So I went up, and they wanted me to, there was some artifacts that they wanted me to date. And they were digging a hole in the back for a new sewer line or some other line. and they had come across a skull. And they wanted, there was several other pieces in the hole with the skull, including some old bottles and little leather shoes. And they wanted me to sort of give an approximate date for the other artifacts so they could get some idea of how long the skull might have been there. At the time, one of my former employees was visiting, Peter Nicholson, who at the time was studying to be a doctor. So he came up with me because at that time they weren't entirely sure that it was a human skull, and he confirmed that yes, it was a human skull. It was just missing the lower jawbone. And this remains a mystery. It was sent back east for some study, but I don't think they ever, I think they might have determined that it was a female, but we still don't know why there was somebody buried behind that house. That remains a bit of remains a mystery. But it was one of the more interesting moments of my career. Got to go and look at a skull, and I was able to, some of the bottles there had embossing on them, and we were able to date them to late 1800s, early 1900s. And this house was probably built in about 1899. It shows up in the 1900 tax records. That's the first year we have records for. So it was definitely built before 1900. It later became the United Church Manse, the home for the United Church minister, or Methodist originally. But yeah, we still don't know why the skull was back there. As far as we know, the only cemetery in town is where the cemetery is now, on Highway 23 North. There were never any churchyard cemeteries. That was one of the questions that they asked me at the time too. So that remains a mystery. And here's another little mystery that showed up in one of our photographs. There's these 4 young men. One of them's holding a book, possibly maybe a Bible, I don't really know. But there's a cross and a grave. So I have no, and we believe this was taken on Mount Revelstoke, based on the trees there. But we have no idea whether it was a person or a dog or a bear. We really don't know who or what is buried in that grave. It's just another little interesting mystery puzzle.
Any idea who they are, the people?
We thought that might, I'm not really sure. I need to look at some of our other photographs as well to see if we can make a match. At this point, I don't really know who they are. So here's another unsolved murder. This is the grave of Frank Julian. When I'm doing the cemetery tours, I talk about name changes because there was a lot of the Europeans anglicized their name when they got to Canada. One of the more drastic name changes was a man named Cristiano Fosacheca, who became Jack Max. But this one was a little less drastic name change. He went from Francesco Giuliano to Frank Julian. But he was one of the earliest Italian settlers to come to Revelstoke. He was born in Italy around 1852 and brought his wife and their older children over to the United States in the 1880s. They lived in Chicago and San Francisco and Washington, where he was working as a railway contractor. And they came to Revelstoke, they were here by 1893, because his name shows up in a list of people who are working on the, doing contract work on the Arrow Lakes branch of the Canadian Pacific Railway, when they built a branch line from Revelstoke down to Arrowhead, a community that no longer exists, but it was the head of the upper Arrow Lakes, and it was able to, for transportation, boat transportation on the Arrow Lakes from the branch line there. Anyway, he owned a house at 411 2nd Street East, that's still standing, and he also owned some property on the Illecillewaet River, somewhere in between where the pedestrian bridge is now and the skate park, somewhere in that area is, we believe, where he had his property. He had ads in the paper occasionally stating that he had wood and hay for sale. He also was a bit of a market gardener, sold vegetables. He was age 58 at the time of his death. There's a lot of rumors about why he was murdered. It was believed that he could have gotten sort of crossed the Black Hand or the Mafia when he was in San Francisco or Chicago, but also he was known to be working with the local police to make sure that the Mafia presence stayed out of Revelstoke. There was a large Italian population here, so that was always a little bit of a concern. In 1908, a year before he died, his son-in-law, Fred Dorsetti, was attacked and his throat was slit, but he survived. And the two men, Italian men who attacked him, were sent to prison. So they were, and it was said that he was believed to be in fear of the Mafia. When his body was found, one of the really odd things about it, and made the police immediately treat it as a Black Hand or Mafia murder, was the fact that he had a black mark on his face that was put on by some sort of acid, a cross on his forehead. So what happened is that he was told his family he was going down to his property, leaving the house on 2nd Street, and going to go down and work on his property. There was a story that there was three transient Italian men who were looking for work, and he said that he would pay them for a day's work. They went to Mr. Barewski, who's the grandfather of Fred Barewski, who owns the Regent and other hotels in town. And old Mr. Barewski sharpened the axes for them, and said that they would meet him down on his property. So on Wednesday morning he left. He said he wouldn't be back before evening, but he didn't show up that evening. Originally his family wasn't too worried. They figured he just stayed with friends. And it wasn't until Thursday evening that they started to worry about him being missing. On Friday they were searching for him on his property, but it wasn't until Saturday, September 24th, that his body was discovered by one of the searchers, Louis Cacciato. The location of the body was well concealed from view. It was only a few hundred yards from the main road leading to the Illicilla River in a ravine that crossed the land. The axe was found 20 feet away from the body, leaning against the stump and covered in blood. The newspaper, as I said, there were no publication bans back then. They could say whatever they wanted. So somebody put forward their theory, said it was apparent that the victim was showing the gang, as he supposed, land that they wished to purchase, for they were following a surveyor's line through the brush. When the victim came to a point where the brush was high and thick, the man behind him raised an axe and dealt him a blow on the top of the head, which crushed in his skull. Yeah. Then as the body shot forward into a hole, he was struck again with the blade of an axe on the left side of the neck, his head being nearly severed from his body. The murderers then placed some bush and grass and left the scene. And it does mention here, it says significantly, a peculiar black mark was on the face of Mr. Julian. And they saw that as proof that his death was through the Black Hand. But as I said, the police treated it as a Mafia murder right from the very beginning. And I've even seen the death records in Brandon's funeral parlor, and even on his death or his card in their records, it says Black Hand murder. When they were doing the inquest, one of his daughters, Mrs. Demore, said that her father had often said that he was afraid something would happen to him. Said he had felt disappointed at not being helped more in his work against the Black Hand gang. That his father never went out at night since the affair when Orsetti was stabbed. And there was other reports saying that he has many times stated to friends that the Black Hand gang would get him yet, for he had been picked for death at their hands for years, and sooner or later the Black Hand would fall, and it did, on Wednesday morning, by the three men who were called upon to do the dastardly deed. It was the deceased who, when his son-in-law was nearly murdered a year ago, followed the criminals from point to point, day after day, until he at last landed the gang at Calgary, and who after a trial here were each sentenced to 10 years in the penitentiary. And it also mentions Mr. DeSenza, and I'll mention that in just a minute. But no one was ever arrested in the death of Frank Julian. The case was taken over by the provincial police. There was no RCMP in BC at the time. There was Revelstoke had a local police force, and there was also provincial police. So the provincial police took over the investigation. They sent a sample of the skin with the black mark to a forensic lab in Toronto, and they determined that it was an acid that had caused the mark and the discoloration. And they found the three men, but they said it was certain that they had not been with Julian at the time of the murder. They had alibis. One report said that they'd actually left town before the murder. There was also some speculation that they might have been a decoy for the real murderers. But again, even though they had a $1,500 reward offered for information, nobody was ever charged with it. So it mentioned in one of the newspapers, it said, this spring when Francesco DeSenza was found dead near Greenslide, it was the late Mr. Julian that gave the police the proper clue by discovering the stolen valise of the criminals who undoubtedly killed the old man to get away with their booty. In this case, after following for 2 weeks the men who were thought to have committed the murder, they had to give up the search, and the murderers have not been apprehended. So this was something that happened in June of 1910, so just a few months before Frank Julian died. The newspaper story said that when the freight train on the south track was nearing Greenslide, northbound on Monday morning, they rounded a curve and they saw an obstruction on a track. It was seen to be a sectionman's hand car with the body of a man stretched out on it, the car being stationary on the track. The engineer whistled loudly, but the man apparently took no notice. The car was hurled some distance and the man was flung to the side of the track. When picked up, the man was unconscious and deathly cold, as if he had been half dead before the train struck him. He was taken to the hospital but never regained consciousness. He died that same afternoon. He was employed by the Bowman Lumber Company, and there was suspicion of foul play. 2 men had been seen lurking in the bush by the train crew, and he died from a heavy blow to the skull, but it wasn't conclusive whether it was from somebody who had inflicted the blow or from the train itself, and it was left as an open verdict. And that was sort of considered as part of one of the factors in Frank Julian's death, that he was digging into that as well. So again, it remains unsolved. That's his marker in the Revelstoke Cemetery. So that was September 21st, 1910. So this is another mystery, is what happened to Bob Limburn. Bob Limburn was one of Revelstoke's ski heroes. He was born in Ontario in 1912 and came to Revelstoke with his family as a child. They lived on a farm at the base of Mount McPherson. He never tried skis until he was 13 years old, but then sort of caught on to the skiing fever that was definitely a part of Revelstoke history, and he built a jump on his family farm. He entered his first competition in 1926 at the age of 14, and in his own words was an absolute flop. But he was determined that he was going to get better, so he practiced every chance he got. And within a year, he was winning in his class and getting close to record jumps as a boy jumper. In 1932, he got a world record jump of 269 feet, which beat Nils Nelson's 1925 record of 250 feet that had stood there since 1925. He also got a second record jump of 287 feet in 1933. Bob was really the local hero in 1931 when they had an event in town that came to be known as the Great Fiasco. It was the day of the Dominion Championships, and this was the first year that eastern skiers had come to compete on the local hill. And of course, the skiers from back east got here and they saw this hill and they were absolutely terrified. And they said they wouldn't jump over it, and most of the judges who were also from the east said, oh no, that's way too dangerous, they can't go over that jump. So they had all of these A-class jumpers going over the boys jump, or the B jump, and the locals were absolutely outraged. It says that after all it says the spectators booed and were incredibly upset. Here were the best jumpers from the east refusing to jump. It was alleged that the competitors had decided the night before that they were not going off the big hill. After all the competitors went off the B jump, Bob Lindburn walked up to the Class A jump and effortlessly and beautifully jumped 196 feet.
Wow.
He jumped twice in defiance of the judges. The judge, Grimsgard, reported to the Revelstoke Review that the judges deemed the hill unsafe, and that Lindburn was able to pull off the jumps because he had the confidence of training on the big hill. They disallowed Lindburn's jumps, stating that they were exhibition jumps only. The crowd was irate and stayed that way for a while, and it actually caused a division between the east and west in terms of the skiers. So a few days after this, they held a local tournament to protest that the big hill was not unsafe. Bob Lindburn made 6 jumps, and of course, remember, when he's making these jumps, he's having to walk up the hill with his skis every time to go on the jump again. So he made 6 jumps averaging 226 feet, a feat never equaled in the Dominion. They called that the Day of Vindication. That brought out all the local jumpers, including Bob Lindburn, Hans Gunnarsson, and Ted Morgan for Class A jumps, and said the Class B jumpers performed better than the Eastern Dominion competitors of the previous week. And even on the boys on the C and D jumps jumped off the B hill. The locals were raring to go after being shut down by Eastern judges. And that was the year that they started referring to the big hill as Suicide Hill. So this added to the prestige of the jumpers and brought even bigger crowds to the events. Bob Lindburn also represented Canada in the 1932 Olympics in Lake Placid. He came in 18th. He made what we believe to be the first solo ski ascent of Mount Begbie in May of 1932. Took the whole day. He left early in the morning, got up at noon. He stopped and had his lunch of raw eggs and oranges and raisins, which he said was the best lunch for strenuous exercise. Got to the base of the glacier, took his skis off, climbed to the top, came back down and skied down the mountain, arriving back down before nightfall. He suffered a concussion in 1935 that was very severe, and that ended his ski career. They made sure that he always had a job at the local CPR station. He did serve overseas during the Second World War with the Royal Canadian Engineers. He suffered a crushed foot and spent some time recovering in Shaughnessy Hospital. Then one of the things that he did on a regular basis was to go out for a walk with his dog. He would walk about 3 miles north of town and then come back. And one day he never came back. I believe it was around 1971, and just never showed up again. They believe said he possibly could have fallen into the river and drowned, but nobody knows for sure. So there's no death certificate because his body was never found, and there was no proof of death. But he remained definitely one of Revelstoke's ski heroes, and kind of a legend in town as well. I've just thrown in a few photographs that are, that I don't know what happened. This is a wreck at Twin Butte, east of Revelstoke. I think it was around 1903 or 1904. The bridge collapsed there, but I haven't been able to find anything in the newspapers yet about that particular incident. So I just wonder what the heck happened to cause a bridge collapse of that extent. And we actually have a couple of other photographs that were taken when they were rebuilding the bridge as well. The CPR records that we have in our archives date probably after this date. The earliest ones we have are 1909. Here's another mystery. Who was Charles Edwards? This is the home of Lida and Charles Holton, and it was built in 1897 at the top of First Street Hill. It's still there, operating as a bed and breakfast. Beautiful home. And Lida Holton was the daughter of a man named Craven Silcott, and her marriage certificate gives the name Silcott, and all of her formal records give the name Silcott. But when the family came here in about 1894, they were going under the name Edwards. Her father was going by the name Charles Edwards. What we're not 100% sure of is whether Craven Silcott and Charles Edwards are the same person. We believe that they were. The other possibility is that Lida's mother remarried and had another husband who was Charles Edwards. But we're pretty sure, and the family is pretty sure, that Charles Edwards was Craven Silcott. So Craven Silcott was born in Ohio in 1840. They were an old American family, going back several generations. In 1880, he was living in Youngsville, Ohio with his wife, Mary Ann Young, and their children, James, who was 14 years old, Eliza, or Lida, who was 2 at the time, and Drennan Edward, known as Eddie, who was just a baby. He was working as a dry goods merchant, and he was given the job as a cashier in the House of Representatives. And in December of that year, he was accused of fleeing with about $72,000, which was quite a fortune at that time. There was a whole bunch of stories about what happened to him after he left. One story is that he had a French-Canadian lover, and he went with her to Montreal and left his family behind, and then the family eventually moved into Canada. Other stories say that he fled to Mexico. But in the 1890s, early 1890s, the Edwards family was living in Vancouver, where Charles Edwards was running a hotel. And then in 1893 or 94, they arrived in Revelstoke from Vancouver, where Charles Edwards had been running the Leland Hotel and the Manor House Hotel. So we believe that that was Craven Silcott, that his family had rejoined him at some point, and they had been traveling around, made it into Canada, and eventually made it to Revelstoke. Charles Edwards continued to, when they came here, they were running the Victoria Hotel, which was owned at the time by William Cowan. And he was referred to as Captain Edwards. It was saying that he was an Australian sea captain. So he completely reinvented himself. And his children, they took the name Edwards. But as I say, in any official records, they were still Silcotts. So Lida Edwards, his daughter, married Charles Holton in 1897. They had 2 sons. They became kind of really high society in Revelstoke. Their house, actually on the 3rd floor, was built as a ballroom. So that you could still, this big open room up on the 3rd floor. They had a lot of events there for the Anglican Church, the Red Cross Society. Mrs. Holton, Lida or Liza, was known as sort of one of the champion bridge players in town. She was the head of the Women's Canadian Club and the Women's the Red Cross Society, and really involved in doing good works. So it's sort of interesting how this daughter of a criminal, possible criminal from the States, ended up as Revelstoke High Society. But we still have a little bit of questioning in our mind about whether it actually was the same person. And I've always puzzled over this photograph. I think it maybe just the way the photograph was taken. But there's a dog sitting up there, and it kind of looks like a baby there, but it's a little odd. We've always called that the ghost baby picture, because we couldn't quite figure out what was going on there. It could have been a glitch in the photo too, but always made for an interesting story.
There's something there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you look at it closely, there is a face, kind of a face on it, but We have the copy that we have came from the provincial archives, so I don't have the original to go back and rescan at a higher resolution.
I think that's crazy.
So here's a mini mystery, and it's also an example of something that happened in Revelstoke a lot, moving buildings, especially when the lower town, Front Street was sort of dying out as the business area, but there was some perfectly good buildings down there, so they moved a lot of the buildings up to this part of town. This is right at the corner of First Street and Mackenzie Avenue. That's where the clinic is up there, and the Revy Outdoors down there. That's where the Royal Bank is now. This building on this corner was the original Molson's Bank, and yes, it was the same family as the brewery. They had a bank as well. But what I'm really wondering about is what is all this stuff piled up on the side of the streets there? Looks like there's wood. It's not just a snow pile. There's sort of wood and stuff in there. And I haven't
been torn down. It's all.
Could have been from something that was torn down and left, but I haven't been able to figure that one out.
The building they're replacing exploded. Pushed all the scrap away and brought in the new building.
Yeah, I'm guessing that they're probably taking this one down to this side of the street, which is, there were several buildings, business buildings down there, but I can't be sure exactly which building that one was. So that's not a huge mystery, just a bit of a puzzle. This is a pretty amazing photograph. They had the first winter sports carnival in Revelstoke in 1915. That's when there'd been ski clubs before that, but in 1914 they formed a competitive club and they wanted to have competition. So they had the first ski jump that year. They had distance races, and they made it a really big deal. They brought in a former CPR worker who was known to be a good ice carver, a snow carver, and he carved this 40-foot snowman, and they actually had it wired there so that the lantern that he was holding actually lit up. So that's my little question, is how the heck did he do that? But it's a pretty amazing photograph. The mayor at the time gave this typical long-winded speech, and they had peanuts for all the kids, something that wouldn't happen today, and another thing that wouldn't happen today, they had a snowball fight for all the boys. But just another little, just an interesting little story. So there's a story in town, legend that goes back decades, about the Mount Begbie Iceman. So there's a story that kind of persists about, is there somebody buried in the glacier of Mount Begbie? The first record of the story goes back to the 1890s, when the local magistrate, Thomas Livingston Haig, told a story to his daughter about being taken up Mount Begbie and shown an Indian trapper, the body of a completely preserved, his body completely preserved within the ice. And Haig mentioned its preservation in complete condition. The gathering thickness of the ice had begun to make the body gradually less visible. And it's interesting how I heard about this story. Back about 10-15 years ago, there was a man visiting who was a scientist from UK, he's from Scotland. He actually looked a lot like Sean Connery, and talked like him too. And he was, I can't remember the exact term, but his field of study was studying plant material on frozen ice people. So there was a body found in Haines Junction, there was a Uffizi Iceman. His job was to look at any plant material that was found on or around that person and study that to sort of add to the body of information about these frozen people that have been discovered. So he had been at the provincial archives and had heard this story that there might have been, well, actually he had been, this woman, the daughter of Thomas Livingston Haig, had actually come up to him after one of his talks in England and said, I have this, my father told me this story So he showed me the letter that this woman had written, and when he was in BC doing some research, he was curious about this, so the staff at the archives got him in touch with me, and he came up here. He didn't actually go up walking on the glacier, but he did get a helicopter ride over it. He decided that the story was kind of in the same realm as the Loch Ness Monster and the Abominable Snowman, but the story has persisted over the years. When they built the Big Bend Highway in 1940, they were talking about the story again then, and I think they were using it as a tourist draw to get people to hear. And there's several versions of it. One account says that it could have been a gold seeker during the gold rush of the 1860s. And some accounts say that they actually could see the body under the ice. One described a man powerful in build, black hair receding from a bald spot, a bushy beard descending almost to his waist. He was wearing a woolen hunter's coat that came almost to his knees, and across his shoulders was an ancient flintlock rifle. I think some of it was kind of invented by Arvid Lundell, who was the newspaper editor at the time, to keep the story going.
That's a great picture.
So, and this one section of the mountain, the locals often referred to it as the Indian, because they thought it looked like the head of a person lying down, and hands folded across the chest. So of course that term isn't considered appropriate any longer, but I think that sort of added to the legend.
Well, Tilly.
And so this photograph came in last year or so, and it came from the McKinnon family, and it was labeled one of the first hotels in Revelstoke. But I don't know, I'm not sure if I believe that. It would have been on Front Street, because that's where the early hotels were. But I haven't found anything else or any other photographic evidence to back that one up. But it's, yeah, the bakery on the side of it.
Fence and all,
Yeah, but-
more like what's the sign say? Bakery?
Bakery. But that one, I can't be sure whether that actually is a Revelstoke photo or not.
Looks like it's too far back from the road.
Yeah, I'm not sure I believe that it's local, but there's not enough evidence around it to tell one way or the other. Except for the fact that there aren't a lot of burnt off trees, which you would expect it to be if it was here in Revelstoke. And this is one that came from the Provincial Archives, labeled Farwell 1885, and I don't believe that one either. Just doesn't look right. There's buildings up on the hill there, so I don't think that one's correct either. Certainly doesn't look like the other pictures we have of Farwell. No, so I don't think that one's labeled correctly.
Red Devil Hill.
Well, there wasn't that kind of, there wasn't anything else out there at Red Devil Hill at that time.
No.
There's no,
Can you zoom in on
no
any of the
gravel or
signs?
big rocks like that in that area for sure.
No, I have zoomed in and I haven't been able to determine anything that tells me that may have been Farwell, so I don't believe that one either. So you can't always trust written evidence either. This is another one that came from the Provincial Archives. It says Snow Mushroom, Revelstoke, January 1910. And it's quite an awesome snow mushroom. You can see why they call it a snow mushroom. But I haven't been able to figure out where that might be in town either. There's a fairly substantial house there, but I can't identify it. There's not quite enough of the mountain slopes to tell exactly where that might have been.
Eastern access area.
Yeah, but I don't know if there would have been anything that substantial out there.
No.
That Johnson house was a big house that burned down from the.
Oh, and where would that
On
one?
Eastern
the
access.
CPR Hill.
Above the dog.
Okay,
No,
so,
above the dog, the icicles.
oh yeah, so that,
Oh, yeah, hanging
well,
down, yeah.
so do you think it might have been close to the eastern axis? There's really,
It looks like a telephone or a CPR telephone pole there.
yeah. It's a neat photograph,
Yeah, for sure.
but again, a little bit of a puzzle. This is a really, really neat photograph. It came recently from the family of Peter Peterson. He was a fellow who came here from Denmark in the 1880s, and he had a hall, public hall down on Front Street in the 1890s. So we believe this was taken in Peterson's hall. But when we looked at it closely, we thought this woman looks like she could be Japanese. And I've shown it to Harumi, who works with me. And she said that the clothing is not traditional kimonos, but she said it's probably what Westerners would have used as sort of costume style kimonos. And she said the hairstyles are sort of Japanese. These women are clearly Caucasian, but this woman looks like she could be Japanese. Part of me even wonders if that's Jenny, but you know, that's something that we'll never know. But it's just an amazing photograph.
1, 2, 3.
Getting all the musicians down there too.
Yeah.
And Ruby also said that those were kind of Japanese style lanterns that they're carrying. So they could have been doing like kind of a cultural show.
With those flags in the back indicate anything?
We can't figure out what the flags were. They're probably not Japanese. One of them that could be the Union Jack, but we're not really sure. Yeah. But an interesting photo. And this is one I've shown before that is a bit of a puzzle to us because, you know, I've seen no written record of a wooden bridge, railway bridge in Revelstoke, but this is clearly Mount McPherson. So it's definitely taken here. If it was there, it wasn't there for very long. It fits the profile of the bridge that was there, except for the wooden slats on the side and the roof and there. But otherwise, it does fit the profile of the bridge that was there. So somebody might have decided to cover it for a short period of time, but that's the only photograph I've ever seen that shows that. So a couple of other things that I found.
Footings, Kathy?
What's that?
Those footings, are they the same as footings from other?
They seem to match up. Yeah, the footings seem to match up. And that profile matches up. It's just like that doesn't, it's just the wood that doesn't match up. So I found, I don't have a photograph of this unfortunately, but from the Mail Herald of April 4th, 1908, there was this report. Like a wonderfully bright electric light slowly swinging in the sky is the signal visible here each night in the heavens on clear nights. The people are wondering whether it is Mars trying to talk to the Earth. The light maintains the same relative position constantly. It seems like a magnificent electric arc light, and if one watches with a telescope closely, it can be seen to move back and forth slowly a short distance. So did we have UFOs in Revelstoke in 1908? Maybe.
Yes, sir.
And then I also found one in September 12, 1968. A UFO was sighted near Revelstoke when Mr. Howery of Hanna, Alberta was driving through town traveling west. The object came down very quickly from the south, hovered about 60 feet in front of and above the car, and swung from side to side, following the car for a distance of about 3 miles. It then took off southward at a high rate of speed. Mr. Howery said that it looked like the beacon on a watchtower and was a light shade of blue. He said it was around 30 feet in diameter and appeared as a glowing light. Another UFO. Here's a couple of other photographs. This is looks like it's probably a circus act, and it looks like that's a high diver. So look at the top of the ladder there, and there he is partway down, and there's some sort of a tub or something that he's diving into there. So I've never seen anything in the newspaper about a high diving act. There was certainly lots of circuses that came through here, and I never heard anything about somebody who broke their neck. So hopefully he survived that.
Roy's my
Which way is he up?
Is he climbing up?
He's right here.
Yeah.
There's his feet, and there's his head.
Pardon?
There's his head,
Yeah.
there's his feet. So
He's on the
diving.
way down.
Yeah, he's on his way down.
Yeah, yeah.
So we hope that he survived that.
Not bungee.
No, I don't think it was a bungee. Here's another little puzzle. This photograph was donated. Cheryl Wolgram and I have walked all over town with that, trying to figure out where it was, and we still can't figure out where it was. We had several good guesses, but none of them panned out when we actually had the photograph on the street with us. And then this little one here is, why is this guy standing on his head on a chair outside the Selkirk Hotel? This is now the part of the Regent Hotel. The hotel was built in 1914. A lot of them have, when you look closely, they have lodge buttons on their, lodge badges on their lapels. But I have no idea why that guy's upside down on the chair in the middle of the street.
That's the guy who lost the bet for sure.
Maybe an initiation.
Who knows? Yeah.
Is there somebody else sort of squatting here?
The kid with the dog.
Yeah, there's somebody squatting with a dog there.
The dog,
Nobody seems concerned about it.
No, they don't. Yeah, that's a good guess, initiation of some sort.
It's a bet.
Yeah, we've lost a bet.
But they'll look like
More
they're looking,
interesting
they're
to
not
me.
looking at him really, they're looking.
No, they're looking at the camera.
Yeah, they're more interested in the camera.
Yeah. And here's a solved mystery. This is one that, it took us a while to figure out exactly where this was. This is another one I was walking all over town with. But this is actually just down the end of our block here. This is where the front of Home Hardware is. So they were building a garage here in 1936. And once I figured out where it was, I did some research in the newspaper and actually narrowed it down to the actual date that they were building it. So this would have been the summer of 1936. So some of the interesting things in it, when we were looking at it, there's this building here that looks like a giant doghouse. It's a big, so I thought, did Clifford the big red dog live there? But it was a wave scale. I discovered that. There's also a house right back here with 3 windows in the front, and that was the city jail, which was moved to Cottonwood Street and is still there now, or Cottonwood and Carlson. But that was, yeah, so we were really happy when we solved that one. Don helped peg that one too. And of course, this was Campbell Avenue, where it used to be a spur line on that side and coal sheds all along there and warehouses. So I'm doing a special presentation at 2 o'clock on Friday, especially for any newcomers or who don't know sort of the general story of Revelstoke history. That's another free presentation as part of Welcome Week. And our next Brown Bag History, we've got a special guest speaker, Rosemary Tracy, who will be talking about Italian traditions and celebrations. She's our Italian researcher here in Revelstoke. That'll be the 11th. And then the week after that, we're doing our Brown Bag History party, or Christmas party for the season. And then we'll start up again in January, and I've got the January schedule on the side there if you wanted to take a copy of that. So thank you very much for coming today. Are there any questions or comments or any other mysteries?
Yeah, what about December 11th? You're not skipping a week then for the party? It's
No,
next,
it'll be the week after the 11th,
Yeah.
yeah. So you can fit it in before Christmas. Any other comments?
There